How did 75 Squadron contribute to the defence of Port Moresby? We look at how the RAAF was prepared for the joint battle in New Guinea in early 1942.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 113 of the Principles of War podcast, number 75 Squadron at Port Moresby, 1942. Last week, we looked at the generation of the combined arms effect, creating a dilemma for the enemy where if they respond to one type of threat, they're going to expose themselves to another. We discussed all of the effort that the Japanese went to be able to provide artillery support to their troops when they were attacking and in the defence. And we also looked at how little effort had been put into the provision of a combined arms capability for the Australians. That makes a neat segue into the capabilities of the Air Force, because if for some reason you're unable to generate sufficient combined arms capability, one of the ways that you can risk mitigate is with tactical air support, aircraft flying in support of troops in contact. And indeed, this is how General Kenny, the commander of the 5th Air Force, saw the battle playing out. Here is the way that he saw the provision of combined arms from an operational level. He wrote, "Tanks and heavy artillery can be reserved for the battlefields of Europe and Africa. They have no place in jungle war. The artillery in this theatre flies. In the Pacific theatre, we have a number of islands garrisoned by small forces. These islands are nothing more or less than aerodromes from which modern firepower is launched. Sometimes they are true islands like Midway, sometimes they are localities on large land masses. Port Moresby, Lae and Boona are all on the island of New Guinea, but the only practicable way to get from one to the other is by air or by water. They are islands as far as warfare is concerned. Every time one of these islands is taken, the rear is better secured and the emplacements for the flying artillery are advanced closer and closer to Japan itself." Now, this is fantastic in theory, but there are a couple of prerequisites that you need for the provision of close air support to troops. Firstly, you'll need air superiority, or ideally, air supremacy. That means that the aircraft providing that close air support are going to be able to focus on actually doing their mission, avoiding anti-aircraft artillery. They don't have to worry about enemy fighters attempting to interrupt their mission. You're going to need doctrine and the elements that support that doctrine for the coordination of airstrikes from the troops on the ground. And that is not a simple thing to do, particularly in the jungle, particularly in mountainous jungle. And lastly, you'll need aircraft with trained pilots. That may sound obvious, but it is an important prerequisite. To look at air power's contribution to the Kokoda Campaign, we're going to look at 75 Squadron. I'm going to do that for a couple of reasons. They were the first ones to deploy to Port Moresby. Also, we can lament how poorly prepared for combat the militia battalions were. We can also lament the lack of jungle training for the 2nd AIF battalions. The lack of preparedness has a very familiar ring to it when we look at the preparation of the RAAF in general and 75 Squadron in particular. What did this all mean? It meant that just as a lot more than should have been asked from the troops during the Kokoda Campaign, a lot more is going to be asked of the pilots who are flying. Aircraft, training, conditions, concentration of force, none of these things will set 75 Squadron up for success. And we want to look at why that was the case. Before we get into it, there's two important things to mention. Firstly, why wasn't 75 Squadron providing close air support to the troops during the Battle of Ishirava? Very good question. They were decisively engaged at the Battle of Milne Bay. It would be only 44 days that they were in Port Moresby before they had to withdraw back to Australia because of combat losses. There, they would regroup and then deploy to Milne Bay. What's important about Milne Bay? Let me use the description of the importance of Milne Bay that comes from Field Marshal Sir William Slim. He's the commander of 14th Army in India. He was rebuilding 14th Army after some crushing defeats at the hands of the Japanese. He wrote, We were helped too by a very cheering piece of news that reached us, and of which, as a morale raiser, I made great use. In August and September 1942, Australian troops had, at Milne Bay in New Guinea, inflicted on the Japanese their first undoubted defeat on land. If the Australians, in conditions very like ours, had done it, so could we. Some of us may forget that of all the Allies, it was Australian soldiers who first broke the spell of the invincibility of the Japanese army. Those of us who were in Burma have cause to remember. That is very high praise indeed from one of the greatest generals of the Second World War. That's from his book, Defeat into Victory, one of the best military autobiographies I've ever read. There are a lot of lessons learnt from there. What was it that had the decisive impact in this decisive battle? Lieutenant General Sid Rowell wrote that the decisive factor was probably the action of 75 and 76 Squadrons RAAF on the first day. General Clowes, who was the commander at Milne Bay, wrote that it was the Kitty Hawk Squadron's incessant attacks over 3 successive days that proved the decisive factor. He spoke of the magnificent efforts on the part of our RAAF comrades. The Kitty Hawks were able to not only provide close air support, but they were also able to sink some of the barges of the invasion force. They made it more difficult for Japanese resupply. They also made it difficult for Japanese aircraft to operate in the area. The references for today include Whispering Death, the excellent book by Mark Johnson, which talks about the role of the RAAF in the Pacific War. And there's also a great YouTube video, which is an old ABC documentary on 75 Squadron at Port Moresby, and I'll include a link to that in the show notes. Looking at the air component for the Kokoda Campaign, there's a couple of things to remember. Firstly, the Kokoda track derives its name from the airstrip at Kokoda. Before the war, it was the main stopping point. Logistics from the air was important predominantly for the gold mining industry, but it would be much more important once it became contested between the Japanese and the Australians. Supply by air was a lot easier than the large numbers of porters that would be required to carry logistics over the mountains. Sid Rowell, the commander of New Guinea Force, saw his primary job as the retention of Port Moresby as an air base. Not only would it be required as a logistics base to fly supplies into Kokoda, but don't forget, New Guinea Force was also supporting an independent company out at Wau, and it would be building up for the forces at Milne Bay. The airbase would be required to defend Port Moresby from air attack, and it would be required as a base from which to stage strikes, predominantly at Rabaul, which was rapidly becoming the Japanese main logistics base. In early 1942, there were 2 main airfields in Port Moresby. There was 7 Mile Drone. This is where 75 Squadron would be based. That would become known as Jackson's Field, and today it is Jackson's International Airport. That Jackson is John Jackson, who was the squadron leader of 75 Squadron. The other airfield was 5 Mile Drone. This would go on to be the busiest airfield in the Southern Hemisphere in 1943. That gives you an indication just how important Port Moresby was and how important it would come to be. 5 Mile Drone would go on to be called Ward's Field, and that is, of course, after Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Ward, the CO of the 53rd Battalion. He had a significant role in the construction of the airfield. The war in the Pacific against the Japanese had not been going well up to this point for the RAAF. In Malaya and Singapore, the Brewster Buffalo squadrons had performed very poorly. Our Malaya campaign series looked at why they were flying Brewster Buffaloes and why Australia wasn't manufacturing a decent fighter at the time. As another example of just how poorly prepared the RAAF were for war against the Japanese, we'll look quickly at No. 24 Squadron. In November 1941, so just 1 month before Pearl Harbor, the complement of No. 24 Squadron included 1 ferry battle, 3 de Havilland Moth minor biplane trainers, 5 Lockheed Hudson twin-engine light bombers, and 11 Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation Wirraway monoplane trainers. The 2-seater Wirraways were expected to be employed on operations as fighters, and that is a role that they were described fit for by the RAAF historian Alan Stevens as only suitable for such a role in the minds of the airboard. Number 24 Squadron started moving their Hudsons to Rabaul on the 5th of December 1941, and by the middle of the month, their Wirraways were up there with them as well. On the 20th of January, Rabaul was raided by over 100 Japanese aircraft. This raid was led by Commander Mitsuo Fukuda. He had led the raid on Pearl Harbor. 2 Wirraways were already up patrolling, and they immediately engaged the first wave of attackers. The 6 remaining Wirraways then scrambled. 1 crashed on takeoff, 7 got airborne, 3 were shot down by Zeros, 2 crash-landed with significant damage, 1 landed with minor damage, and the other Wirraway was unscathed. In 10 minutes, the RAAF had lost 6 aircrew and 5 had been wounded. One of the Australian soldiers at Rabaul wrote, "We sat at our guns, shocked by the massacre we had just observed." After the battle, LaRue signalled headquarters, "2 Wirraways, useless defence. Will you now please send some fighters?" To which he got the reply, "Regret inability to send fighters. If we had them, you would get them." The next day, he was ordered to attack the invasion fleet with all available aircraft. Now, he had 2 serviceable Wirraways. They didn't have any bomb racks. And he had 1 serviceable Hudson. That was his only aircraft with which he could attack the invasion fleet. That Hudson dutifully took off but was unable to find any targets. The next day, he was instructed to keep the airfield open. After consultation with his intelligence officer, he replied back with "Morituri vos salutamus." This created issues at headquarters because they thought that there'd been an issue with either the encryption or decryption of the coded message. However, one of the officers there recognised it for what it was. It was Latin. It was the phrase that gladiators had used to greet their emperor. And it meant, "We who are about to die salute you." He was then ordered to turn his ground crew into infantry and to return to Port Moresby to take control of a squadron there. To the first order, he replied that trained RAAF ground crew would be more useful in future operations than as infantry now. And to the second order, he just ignored it. Through careful planning, he was able to ensure that only 3 of his men were captured by the Japanese. The rest were able to escape. He escaped to Port Moresby, where he would take command of Number 32 General Reconnaissance Squadron. Number 32 Squadron was just one of the 3 squadrons that were based at Port Moresby at the time. The other 2, Numbers 11 and 20 Squadron, were Catalina flying boat squadrons. At 3 a.m. on the 3rd of February 1942, the residents of Port Moresby were woken by a low grumbling noise. This was the sound of the incoming air raid, the first air raid on Port Moresby. 6 bombers dropped 21 bombs between them. An army sergeant was killed. Not a lot of damage was done amongst the town, but it did create havoc amongst the local population. There was looting amongst the Australian forces stationed there, and of the local inhabitants, many of them left back to their villages in the jungle, leaving the local government without much of the workforce that it depended upon. That night, the RAAF responded with 5 of the Catalina flying boats conducting a bombing raid on Rabaul. The Japanese had night fighters, and one of the Catalinas had to fly into the smoke of the local volcano at Rabaul to evade pursuit. The raid on Port Moresby was to be one of many. The next day, Number 75 Squadron is formed. Only 16 days after the first raid on Port Moresby is the first air raid on Darwin. That's on the 19th of February. There are no fighter squadrons defending Darwin on the day that that attack occurred. And indeed, there are no fighter squadrons defending Darwin for 3 weeks after that first raid. Australia declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939. The first air raid on Darwin occurs on the 19th of February 1942. That is 900 days after Australia entered the Second World War. And yet 900 days after entering the Second World War, there was not one fighter squadron available to defend Darwin. It would be over 3 weeks before a fighter squadron was stationed at Darwin to defend it. The air raid was quite devastating. It was once again led by Mitsuo Fukuda. 242 aircraft were employed, 108 were carrier-based, and 54 were land-based medium bombers. Casualties would include 236 killed, between 300 and 400 wounded, 30 aircraft destroyed, 11 vessels sunk. How did we get to a point where Port Moresby was undefended? And in fact, Darwin was undefended. Well, to work that out, we're going to have to go all the way back to the founding of the RAAF. At what point did it become apparent that Japan was the main threat to the security of Australia and its national interests? In 1920, the Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, the Little Digger, gave a speech to Parliament where he said that he himself was a fanatic for aviation and his government was going to allocate funds for the creation of an efficient air force. This air force was to be an insurance policy against a possible conflict with Japan. Japan at that point was identified as the only likely threat to Australia. On the 9th of November 1920, the Air Board was formed. This would have 4 members. On that same day, 3 new Air Force-specific ranks were created. The Air Board would be made up of Wing Commanders Dickie Williams, Jimmy Goebel, Squadron Leader Percy McBain, and the 4th member was a civilian. He was the finance member, Albert Joyce. He would go on to become the Auditor General for the government from 1946 to 1951. At the first meeting of the Air Board, Wing Commander Williams presented a memorandum on the structure of the new Australian Air Force, and on the 31st of March 1921, the Australian Air Force came into being. It had 164 aircraft. Now, many of these were still in packing crates because 128 aircraft had been gifted to Australia from Great Britain after the war, and it had 151 personnel. So there was actually more aircraft than there were personnel in the Australian Air Force. And in August 1921, it became the Royal Australian Air Force. In October 1922, Wing Commander Richard Williams becomes Chief of the Air Staff. He does this at the ripe age of 32. This was because of the insistence of the Prime Minister, Billy Hughes, that the Chief of the Air Staff of the Royal Australian Air Force should be Australian. The problem for the RAAF would be the growing of the next rank of senior leaders for the Air Force. The role of Chief of the Air Staff would rotate between Williams and Goebel. This would create problems. Goebel was born in Croydon, Victoria, and during the First World War, he served with the Royal Naval Air Service and he was an ace with 10 victories. Williams, on the other hand, was from Army. He had joined a militia unit in South Australia in 1909, commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1911, and joined the Permanent Military Forces in 1912. He took part in the Central Flying School's first pilot's course at Point Cook, and he was to graduate as the first student on the 12th of November 1914. He joined No. 1 Squadron of the Australian Flying Corps, and he served in the Middle East. He would go on to be the commanding officer of No. 1 Squadron. The government insisted that the 2 men alternate as Chief of the Air Staff, and indeed, whilst one was serving in the Air Staff, the other would be posted overseas. In the 1922-23 budget, the share of defence spending that would go to the RAAF was cut to just 5.4% of all defence spending. The government was concerned about the capabilities of the Air Force, so in 1928 they requested that the RAF Air Chief Marshal Sir John Salmon come to Australia to look at the problem. Salmon declared the Air Force not fit for war operations. He recommended a 9-year program of reinvestment in the Air Force. Stanley Bruce was the Prime Minister at the time, and his government did not accept the recommendations of the Salmon Report. This was partially because of economic pressures on the defence budget and because of the fact that the Australian government was following the Singapore strategy. The Navy would be the key defence for Australia. Up until 1936, the RAAF had an average of just 83 officers. The culture within the RAAF began to suffer. The pilots prided themselves on being dashing and skillful, and they did not discourage reckless flying behaviour. To increase the number of pilots within the Air Force, a Citizens Air Force was commenced. This would be capped at 25 paid days of training for pilots. When the Citizens Air Force ran their first training course for pilots, there were 24 crashes, and this was something that the commander of the flying school chose to joke about. In 1924, Flemington Racecourse saw a public demonstration where 4 aircraft crashed on landing in succession. This did nothing to instill confidence in the Air Force in the eyes of the public. In 1927, 4 pilots were killed during a flypast for the Duke of York in Melbourne, and another one was killed at the opening of Parliament in Canberra. In 1932, questions again were raised about the requirement for the independence of the RAAF. Williams again defended the service. The RAAF had managed to maintain its independence, and in 1932, Japan was fighting Chinese forces in Manchuria and Shanghai, and this created growing concern about the need for a stronger defence force. In 1934, the Salmon Report was revisited and approved in a modified format. Political will strengthened in 1938 with the agreement to increase the RAAF from 8 squadrons to 18. This was based on what was being seen on the global stage. In 1935, the Italians had used air power in Abyssinia. In 1936, the Germans had used it in Spain, and in 1937, the Japanese had used it in China. However, the issue now was the procurement of aircraft. Britain was producing the Hurricane, and the Spitfire had just clocked in at 550 kilometres per hour. However, it was viewed as being difficult to get aircraft from Great Britain. They just didn't have the spare manufacturing capacity to meet Australian demand. In 1936, Essington Lewis convened a meeting which was backed by Richard Williams and the government to create a Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. The lead designer would be Lawrence Wackett. Their first aircraft would be the Wirraway. This was based on the NA-16 North American Harvard. It was effectively a trainer. It had 2 seats. It had a top speed of 354 kilometres an hour. And remember, I just mentioned that the British were building Spitfires doing 550 kilometres an hour. In 1938, the Lyons government requested a review of the effectiveness of the RAAF. This was going to be conducted by Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Sir Edward Ellington. Chief of the Air Staff Williams only found out about this when he read about it in the papers. Ellington was critical about the safety culture within the RAAF. He was critical of the purchase of the Wirraway, partially because it was American and not a British design. He was critical of Williams and the Air Board. Williams thought that the government had been conspiring against him, and he was possibly right. The decision to second him to the RAF for 2 years, he found out about that, once again, in the newspapers. He was to be succeeded by Air Vice Marshal Goebel, who would become the acting Chief of the Air Staff in February 1939. Mark Johnson, in his book Whispering Death, writes that Williams had suffered the consequences of long-standing nonchalance about safety in Australian military aviation. His departure was part of the slow transition of the RAAF from a flying club to a professional service. Yet it was badly timed, for with war looming, no one with Williams' intellect or charisma took his place. The government requested that the RAF send a senior officer to become the Chief of the Air Staff for the RAAF. Britain sent Air Marshal Sir Charles Burnett. This would be described as the start of the plundering of Australia's air defence resources for the benefit of Britain's war effort in Europe. He also did little to purchase new aircraft for the RAAF, in particular fighters. Just before Australia would declare war, the RAAF strength was 3,489 personnel, 310 of whom were officers. However, there were just 246 aircraft. None of them would be classed as modern. We had 82 Ansons, 54 Demons, 7 Wirraways, 21 Seagull seaplanes, and 82 trainer aircraft. There were just 12 squadrons. 2 of those were just a nucleus, and 4 were citizen Air Force squadrons. On the 3rd of September 1939, Australia declared war on Germany. The government wouldn't know it at this point, but we were 900 days away from the bombing of Darwin. How would the government, how would the RAAF spend that time in preparing for that attack on the Australian mainland? We see here the manifestation of the imperial defence strategy. What was good for the defence of Great Britain was going to be good for Australia, or that was the thinking. The problem is that government policy is not recognising the increasing risk around the Singapore strategy. We're now setting the conditions for the time when the Singapore strategy would be null and void. If Great Britain is decisively engaged with defence of itself, it isn't going to send the fleet to Singapore to defend Asia. This should have been ringing alarm bells because it would mean that the entire strategy that Australia had been relying on for the last 20 years to defend the nation and its national interests was about to fall apart. Number 10 Squadron RAAF was in Britain to pick up some short Sunderland flying boats from an English factory. The British government requested that this squadron stay in Britain and come under the control of the RAF. The Australian government acquiesced. The Australian War Cabinet in late September offered 6 squadrons of the RAAF to Great Britain. This was at a time when the RAAF made up just 3,500 personnel. If Britain accepted the offer, then the majority of Australian trained pilots would be in Britain. To make matters worse, there were already 450 RAAF pilots on service with the RAF. So there were more RAAF pilots in Britain than there were in Australia. Britain, at this point of the war, was planning on producing 2,250 aircraft a month. Who would fly all of these aircraft? Britain had been doing planning pre-war, and it was estimated that they would need 50,000 aircrew trained every year. They thought that they would only be able to train 22,000 a year. Their plan was to rely on the other 28,000 coming from the Commonwealth, and that meant Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The Minister for Air, James Fairbairn, went to Canada in November 1939 to discuss the Empire Air Training Scheme. Under the Empire Air Training Scheme, or EATS, Australia agreed to train 11,000 aircrew each year until 1943. The scheme ran until June 1944, and Australia up to that point had sent 37,810 personnel. The original scheme had seen almost all of the training being done in Canada. Fairbairn insisted that half of the training be done in Australia. This would see a large number of schools being developed within Australia. It would see skills kept onshore and developed onshore as the number of instructors was increased. And it also meant that Britain would send advanced trainers to Australia to support the training. Fairbairn also supported the Chief of the Air Staff's recommendation to establish 38 air operating bases on Australia's coast. There was a couple of problems with EATS from an Australian point of view. Firstly, Britain saw it as a united Empire Air Force, but all of the senior ranks would be held by RAF personnel. This would limit the opportunity for Australian officers to serve at the senior officer ranks. Unlike the 2nd AIF troops, who would fight as brigades and divisions and whose national sovereignty was fiercely contested by Blamey, the Australian aircrew would just be part of RAF squadrons. Britain was able to allocate incoming pilots from EATS into any squadron that they deemed necessary. There were some nominally Australian squadrons, however these were quite cosmopolitan. The first batch of EATS aircrew departed Australia on the 29th of April 1940, and it would be 1,000 Australians per month who would be leaving after that. Menzies reassured the public that the defence of the nation would be capable with the 591 Avro Ansons and 336 Fairy Battles that Britain would be sending to Australia for training purposes. He thought that these aircraft would be sufficient against any carrier-borne Japanese aircraft. However, a cursory examination of previous Japanese naval aviation activities would have highlighted the fact that this would have been clearly inadequate. EATS did bring advantages to Australia. Firstly, we were able to retain the 6 squadrons that had previously been offered to Britain. Secondly, by the time that war with Japan had commenced, there would be Australian pilots with 2 years of experience against the Luftwaffe. This combat experience would be critical in training up pilots for fighting against the Japanese. Australia would be responsible for recruiting all of the personnel for EATS. Of the first 100,000 personnel who had volunteered for service, 68,000 had volunteered for service in the RAAF. Interestingly enough, though, 57,000 of those volunteered for ground crew rather than air crew. It's interesting to see the issues with the mobilisation for an air force. Johnson describes some of the problems. Earlier in the war, there were more volunteers than the RAAF could process, let alone induct. Fewer than 1/10 of the ground staff applicants had been enlisted by March 1940. At that time, fewer than 40% of aircrew applicants had been interviewed and fewer than 2,000 recruited. This embittered eager young men who had been told by their government that providing trained airmen to Britain was vital. Yet delay was inevitable given that the pre-war regular Air Force had trained fewer than 100 pilots annually, and that there were, early in 1940, only 16 of the 1,000 flying instructors needed to meet the task of graduating some 3,700 pilots annually. Courses for instructors had been quickly instituted through a reconstituted central flying school, and the Air Force doubled in size to 6,000 men between September 1939 and April 1940. By then, its waiting list contained all the men that it could cope with for 6 months. Enlisting the airmen was one thing, training them was another. The speed with which the Air Force grew and the requirement to train pilots quickly increased the risks for individual pilot training. During the Second World War, 485 Australian aircraft were lost to enemy action. However, 740 were lost in accidents at flight training schools. So for every 2 that were lost in combat, 3 were lost in accidents in Australia. Bill Dean Butcher was the medical officer of 75 Squadron while it was based at Port Moresby. We will see in the next episode the incredible casualties that 75 Squadron would take during that brief period of time. However, Dean Butcher said that he did more identifying of remains and burials while he was posted to 1 OTU. That is the operational training unit that was based at Bairnsdale that prepared pilots to fly the Beaufort bomber. Accidents were so common that it was nicknamed Death Valley, and by the end of the war, 1 OTU would have 131 aircrew dead or missing. By December 1941, the RAAF had grown to have 34 EATS schools for aircrew in Australia. It's important to recognise the contribution that these instructors made to the development of the Air Force. It was dangerous, repetitive work. The squadron leader of 75 Squadron was John Jackson. Before No. 75 Squadron was raised, he was posted as an instructor at Point Cook. And he wrote to his wife about it. "I just loathe this joint. This training is a tough job, and I take my hat off to the boys who have been doing it since the war broke out. They have done a fine job, and they are turning the pilots out solidly trained and ahead of schedule. They fly night and day, long hours. Every one of these instructors is longing to be sent overseas, but I doubt if they have any chance of ever getting there. They are so valuable here." The quality of that training is something that we'll look at in the next episode, because Squadron Leader Jackson is going to be leading many of the pilots who've been trained by the Empire Air Training Scheme in Australia.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by Jane Zeeling. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.